everyone. It's not too much to say that news media and a free press is one of the few industries that can lay claim to being essential to democracy. In the US, at least, it's the only business that is guaranteed to be free of government interference in the US Constitution. Yet for an industry that is so essential, it's certainly under a lot of stress. Its traditional revenue source of advertising is being eaten alive by the tech platforms. Newsrooms are shrinking, the business models are up for grabs, and the guy who used to be president of the US identified the professionals who work for news media as enemies of the people. That's a lot. And according to the Edelman Trust Barometer of trust around the world, news media is at an all-time low. 67% of people in the world think news media intentionally deceives the readers. The solutions are manifold. They're new technology, new business models, maybe doubling down on some old-fashioned values. I've seen this firsthand as editor-in-chief and CEO of a company that publishes Inc. and Fast Company, two business magazines. And luckily, we are joined by three other seasoned professionals. Just to review that introduction we got it. Elizabeth Bramson-Boudreau, CEO of MIT Tech Review. Hi, Elizabeth. Josh Benson, who's partner at Old Town Media, which is at the forefront of a lot of new technology and new media properties. And Deep Bagchi, the Chief Product Officer of ITV. Welcome all.
Thank you.
Let's start with a trust question, because that's a big one that bedevils all of us. For me, it became personal one time when I came off stage at an event like this, and a woman came up to me and said, very sweetly, very nicely, please tell me, why do you journalists always lie? That is a different kind of experience from what I had been used to. So Josh, can I put the question to you? That trust questions affected us all differently, but for you, part of the solution lies in reviving local news media. How is that working for you?
Well, it's an attritional war, right? The trust didn't erode all at once. This happened over time, and I think there's no, unfortunately, switch that we can just throw to get it all back.
I wish.
But there's some important areas of opportunity that I think it's incumbent upon us to do everything we can to take advantage of. Local is one of those areas for various reasons, particularly in the US, where when people think of media, and I imagine a lot of those 67% think of media, what they're talking about is ratings-driven cable news, which is incentivized even in the best of cases to sort of think all the time about eyeballs. And you know, that leads to kind of sensationalism, and at this point, as everyone knows, Fox News in particular is presenting a completely different version of the world to its audience than CNN or MSNBC, the relatively fact-based networks, and local is different because of people's familiarity with the local properties or what's left of them, and just the basic fact that local news is different. The cliche in America was, you know, there's no Republican or Democratic way to pick up the garbage. It's just inherently a less polarizing thing when people are talking about municipal issues. There's an opportunity to rebuild some of that trust. The problem is the commercial model collapsed, so we need to just make more of it, right? Similarly, local television affiliates, those same studies show that there's a lot of trust in them, right? People know their local anchors. They tune in for weather and sports and crime, and again, here's an achievable goal. We need to do everything we can to incentivize the inclusion of more civically valuable veggies in that news diet, but people are watching, and people, relatively speaking, still trust, local TV. And then I think there's, as with all these things, there's definitely a tech component, right? Now that the big content platforms have, for the most part, and by threat of force, have gotten away from the ridiculous conceit that they are not publishers, but merely facilitators of information, they need to do something about it. And there's fantastic strides being made by companies like Dublin-based Kinzen, where they're actually building real technology to fight purveyors of disinformation in real time. Like, they're actually out there fighting Nazis and anti-vaxxers and catching misinformation where it begins to bubble up so that they can kind of super empower the human moderators to do something about it and take responsibility for it. So again, none of this is remotely a silver bullet, but it all has to do with that question of trust. And I think it's starting to feel like there's a critical mass of serious thinking and serious resources being put behind some of these efforts. So.
Well, good, and more power to them, Josh. Deep, the trust question is different in the US and the UK. You've spoken to us about that. Can you take that apart, maybe help us understand the lessons that might be buried in this?
Yeah, I think today is a really interesting day to be talking about this subject because you just had the Reuters Institute of Journalism with their annual kind of digital report that they come out for digital news. And it shows generally around the world, trust in news is declining. But there's some interesting aspects in the UK, for example, which is really the fact that we have this public service broadcasters, the BBC and the ITV, have really been able to hold on to that trust in terms of the trust that people have in them for their news and for their output. And I think the UK is also different in the US in this question of business model. A lot of media companies have news almost as a service, as a right for people to be educated and to know what's going on. And there's a lot of regulation around Ofcom, around impartiality and fairness. And so all of that, I feel, while the UK ratings for news trust is also declining, overall, the fact that the public service broadcast is able to hold their own and keep that level of trust has been really important for people.
Good. Elizabeth, a slightly different angle for you on the trust question, which is about the relation between media and technology companies. It used to be, and I remember in my days at Business 2.0, for example, an admiring relationship. It's turned kind of sour lately. What's going on there? Why is that? And what do you see as the path forward to repairing it, if it needs repair?
So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting having sat and watched most of your conversation with Christopher earlier. And, he made the point, we need to be careful about build fast and break things, move fast and break things. And of course we do. Of course we know that now. And of course we need to show caution in the way we take decisions as a society, as entrepreneurs, as business leaders, about the use of technology in our organizations, in our platforms. But I think there was a long period of time that has ended in which tech media was cheerleading the rise of these mammoth, uber-powerful tech platforms like the Facebooks and all the rest. And we clearly are out of that. We are clearly in a situation where tech media is calling to task the tech leaders who have taken decisions that are rather more focused on their own bottom lines than on the societal bottom lines. And so I think it's healthy that we've swung to the other side of tacked to the other shore. The trouble, of course, is that you also are missing out. We are, as a society, missing out on stories that we try to tell a lot of, which is how much technology enables that is really for a greater good. Now, it's not unilaterally such. It's not de facto going to be the case that technologies are going to build a better world. But my God, is there incredible potential. Things like mitigating the impact of climate change. Things like disease prevention. Hello, how many of us have the vaccine? That was a technology. The messenger RNA vaccine was a technology development that couldn't have come about without all of the other things that led to it. So what the stories that we try to tell at MIT Technology Review are really about how much, when properly exercised, controlled, and careful decisions are considered, how much is the potential, how much potential there is for really great societal transformation of the sorts that we all dream of can come about. And what's interesting about what my previous panelists here have shared is that for us, everybody knows MIT, the brand, and it stands for the world's leading technology and Institute of Technology and Innovation and Engineering Leadership. So we're in a different situation. I mean, some of the skepticism around media helps a brand like ours because if you know, a few things about technology, probably you're favorably inclined towards MIT. So when we were publishing about, what was in the vaccine, what you should be thinking about with respect to whether you should have the vaccine, which is less an issue in this country than it was in the United States, we found that there was a real sort of a sense of affirmation that we got for our, the integrity and the reputation and the authority that we have as a result of our connection to MIT. We're independent from MIT, but we are owned by MIT, and that's a very vital part of our organizational DNA.
Okay, well, by bringing up your connection to MIT just underscores how varied the business models are now in the media world. And so why don't we pivot to business models, where a lot of evolution is taking place. Deep, you have talked a lot about customer focus, as opposed to the traditional advertising-based business model, when the focus was on keeping the advertiser happy, bringing people in, and then selling their attention to someone who wanted to sell them something else. So in your field, streaming is obviously one way that is being manifest. Who's doing that well, and how do you avoid the problem, like a two-part question, how do you avoid the problem of kind of people being saturated with streaming services and deciding they're not going to open their wallet one more time?
Wow, there's a lot there. I think the challenge that all of us face, whether it's print publishers or television companies, is this question of business model transformation. As everything goes to digital and goes online, you need to have a direct relationship with your customers. You need to be customer focused, customer obsessed, and I think all of us, in this field are trying to do that. More and more companies are trying to create roles like mine, which is Chief Product Officer, and to have that customer focus. I think just in terms of saturation, there are really two business models largely. There are others like transactional, but it's largely around ad-supported or subscription models, right? And I think the interesting thing is that a lot of people are trying to do both. It's become a question of diversification of revenue. So we're about to launch a new streaming service in the UK at the end of this year called ITVX. It's going to have 9,000 hours of content that's free, that's ad-supported. And then it's going to have an upper tier, which is a subscription VOD tier, which is 6,000 hours of subscription content. So you can pay a bit more, remove the ads, and get even more content. And so I think that AVOD, SVOD model, which I think the publishers in news have had for a while. You have this freemium business model. The New York Times had it first with their paywall. You could consume 10 articles, but then if you wanted more, you'd have to pay and subscribe, is an interesting model for the subscription world. And it's not something that's been widely done, because obviously Netflix and Disney and all started with subscription VOD. Increasingly, though, I think in the media space, there's a recognition that having both of those models in one service is a really interesting way of doing it, because for some proportion of your audience, they want to consume your content, but they don't want to pay, and they want to have a free experience with the ads, of course, to watch. And for some others, they're motivated enough to pay. What we see in the UK, for example, is almost 70% of households now have at least one subscription VOD service, so are paying for a streaming service. But actually, what's interesting is on average, each household is paying for at least 2 or more. So the average number is just over 2. And so you see this habit of subscription stacking, which you're also seeing in the news world. You have more and more people buying more than one subscription and stacking it. So either it's New York Times plus one other, or it's the FT plus one another. So there are really interesting similarities between the news publishing world and the general entertainment television streaming world. We think that the AVOD, SVOD model is a really interesting and probably the best one for what we're trying to do. We're going to be one of the first in the UK at that scale and size to do that, to have a mixed AVOD, SVOD model. And the interesting thing is there are places there for news content as well. So we're going to have news within our single streaming service, and we're going to have sports in there, news, entertainment. So it's going to be a Big Ten service with a lot of things in it to give people variety. So it harks back to our PSB roots and what we do so well of being a national broadcaster, but definitely a step forward in terms of the streaming world.
Interesting. Josh, in the startups that you advise and help to fund, what are you seeing in the ways of innovative business models that might lead a path out?
Well, in a way, it's a version at much smaller scale of the kind of diversification that Deep is describing. I think for whatever reason, legacy media publications and journalist founders were both always sort of in the grips of one dogma or another, that sort of ads weren't there anymore, so hard paywalls were going to save everyone. And then, there was a kind of all-on rush to membership, which is essentially like a public TV model where people are paying small amounts for access to nothing in particular, but just because they want the laptop sticker and the warm feeling in their heart. And I think that that the dogma is going away, and I think more and more, particularly of the younger generations of local news organizations, are getting smart about just succeeding by hook or by crook, right? So that's a combination of ads or sponsorships, as they like to call it, and subscription revenue. It's sometimes membership revenue where they can get it. It's also a combination, particularly in the local news space, increasingly of the stupid terms of art are contributed and non-contributed revenue, but it's essentially philanthropy where you can get it and reader revenue where you can't. And it adds up to something, and they're achieving some momentum. So this is, for the first time in a while, it's not a happy story yet, but it's not an entirely sad story, because I think we're watching everyone learning on the fly at this same moment that there's this kind of starting to feel like a critical mass of serious mission-driven funders who really want to make a dent in the problem of the near disappearance of local news. So there are nice things happening.
The not-for-profit business model for media was almost unheard of a few years ago, and now there are the trade group for companies that are funded that way has hundreds of members. Yep. Just in the U.S.
Well, look, that was, I mean, to be fair, that was a silver bullet for a hot second, right? The most highly publicized example of a nonprofit local news organization succeeding is the Texas Tribune, which had some exceptional circumstances at its back, right? It had a deep wealth of money to draw on from the outset and a big market, and they did a number of things right. The moment was right for them. And once again, a lot of us, the journalism people, over-concluded what was possible from that. But again, I think everyone's getting smarter about it. There is more philanthropic backing out there, and it's reasonably conditional on people starting to figure out over time how else they can sustain themselves, which is key, right? Not having a party too early and then the funders get a cold or change their mind or whatever. So again, it's progress, and I think the proliferation of nonprofit or partially philanthropy-funded news organizations is a sign of that.
Okay. The business models, of course, are being driven by outside influences, by the environment. And one of the things that has changed a lot in media and journalism is disintermediation, which I guess has happened throughout many industries in the digital era. In media, what it means is that journalists become brands unto themselves and may, in many cases, feel they don't need the cover of an institution like MIT Tech Review, for example, and go the way of Substack. How are you handling that at your shop, Elizabeth?
So that model, which is to say the championing of individual journalists, is in conflict with the building of a journalistic brand. Before working for MIT Technology Review, I worked at The Economist, which very famously does not have bylines. Everything is, all the editorial content is from the editors. It's changed a lot, The Economist, in the last decade or so. You do see a lot of individual journalists from The Economist tweeting about the article that they published, but that continues to be the way that they have built that organization and foster its special voice in the world. Personally, whether it's because of my background at The Economist or some other characteristic of my personality, I am, as a publisher, my priority is to think about how to build the brand of MIT Technology Review. I recognize, though, that I'm doing that in 2022, and that the journalists who we employ have their own, it's quite importantly, it's a lot about what leadership looks like, I think, for an organization like ours in this era. I can't exactly dictate the way all of the journalists are going to operate and move in the world if I want to acquire, hire, retain really top journalists. To a large extent, I do have to take into consideration their motivations. And in many cases, those motivations are a lot about building their own individual brands. What we've tried to do, and I can think of some pretty exceptional examples of this in the time I've been running the company, is make MIT Technology Review a place where you build your brand, where you build your know-how, to unapologetically say, you may not end your career with us. It would be great if you did, but you may not. But for the time that you're here, we would love for you to do excellent work. We want to support your growth as a journalist. And while we do that, that's about capturing the value that you create and hopefully making it a more attractive place for other rising stars to work for, again, as long as they decide to. So that's how we're approaching that.
Okay.
But it's a change in power dynamics that I honestly can't say that I love.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for your honesty.
Interesting thing there, which is you have the kind of unbundling of journalism brands with journalists going direct to customers in social media. But in the television world, you have the rebundling of more and more brands and studios coming together to be bigger as a single brand, as a single TV service. And that's really interesting because the business model, as we just talked about, both face the same business model challenges. You're being disintermediated and you're facing all of those challenges. But in the television world, everyone's realized that size and scale is really important. So in the case of ITV, for example, we're vertically integrated. So we're a content producer with a big size ITV studios that produces all the shows and then sells them. But a lot of the shows then make it to our streaming service. And it's becoming harder and harder, I think, for individual smaller producers if they're out on their own as independents. Obviously, you can sell shows to other people, but more and more there's an aggregation happening in the space.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Well, media is a big business, and there will be different ways that all of us handle the challenges that we all face. I think one thing that we can say about the future of media is that when we have this panel in 5 years, we'll be talking about a whole different set of challenges, but they won't go away.
No.
So, Deep, Josh, Elizabeth, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking.